Hi, today I'm talking with James Shaw. We talked about role playing games and how this has influenced his facilitator skills. The difference between the two versions of his book. James cares less about the appearance of things and more about the substance of things.
I'm Ivanul from Who's Agile. My pronouns are he and him. Welcome to my channel. You see a lot of agilists around me on this screen. If you want to hear me interviewing, please click that subscribe button because these are the people that I've invited so far. If you think I'm missing people, let me know in the comments. And that like button, well, if you liked today's interview, don't forget to click it.
Hello everyone, and welcome. With me, I have James Shore. Welcome,
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
and having you is one of the things I want to do. No, I lost my mouse pointer again. What I wanted to show is where we are, and I am in Belgium on the little blue dot there on the screen, and you are going thanks to Google Earth. We're going to show you are in Portland. So there you are at this moment, and on my side it's 18:43 in the evening, so 6:43. And on your side, what time is it at this moment?
It is 9:43 a.m. in the morning.
9:43 in the morning. So we're really working globally and doing this. Well, first of all, over the internet, but that also means that it's multiple time zones away.
Mm.
So that's the joys that we have. I think one of the things that I think thanks to the pandemic, we have a lot more of these tools. We had already a few of these, but we have a lot more of these opportunities to talk to each other, and we do it a lot more, I would say. Okay, James, I jumped right into this, but tell the people who are here a little bit. Who are you? What do you want people to know about you?
Well, I'm James Shore. I'm an Agile practitioner and consultant. I have been working in the Agile space since 1999. I presented at the first XP conference, XP Universe, not the XP conference in Europe, but the one in North America called XP Universe in 2001. Um, I've written a book called The Art of Agile Development, which is currently
And
available
it
in a second edition.
and I have
Uh,
here both editions on screen, if I'm correctly.
yeah, I love that you have those side by side because I told them when I was doing the second edition that I wanted to keep the cover mostly the same, but let's have the little sapling grow a little bit. And they did a beautiful job of putting the greenery on the sapling and putting a fish in the glass. And I just love this new cover.
Right, that's one of the questions I had in mind. I really love them that they're looking similar and at the same time there's something new. So I wasn't sure if that was intentional from your side as well, but it's really lovely indeed. That is indeed a very nice thing. And well, the goal is not to talk too much about the book, but I'm a really fan of the book since the very first edition. I've advised it to many people because there's many things in there, and it should be where is it? This should be somewhere here in my bookshelf there. That first edition. I haven't been to the second edition is somewhere on the site. I haven't been to reading it. I know that that Gitte wrote a piece of it, and I know there's some other things that I've already quickly skipped to it just to see what they've written, but I haven't seen everything. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's.
Yeah, I went through the book and it was pretty much a total rewrite. I mean, there were some things that made the cut from the first edition into the second edition, but I went through every single word and updated it. It had been first edition came out in 2007. This one came out end of 2021. So that's I don't know. I can't math on camera. I think 14 years between editions. So there was a lot of stuff to update, and I'm really happy with the new edition. I think it's a substantial improvement.
And is there a reason why you kept the name? Because you could have just said, okay, I write a different kind of book, or well, it's a different book but with a different title. Is
Yeah,
there?
that's a good question. I think from a purely mercenary perspective, putting a new book out with a new name may have resulted in more readers. But O'Reilly approached me and asked me if I could do the second edition, and that was sort of the impetus for doing it. The book has always been written to be sort of evergreen. So even after 14 years, people were still buying it, they were still reading it.
Mm.
So I just wanted keep the name and the approach that people knew and loved. The idea of it as being a reference that you could pick up, flip through, read a couple of pages, and walk away with something useful in that moment. I
Like a
really like that
recipe in a
structure.
sense. Is that a recipe book? Is that how you mean it when you say read a few pages, and is that the kind of thing?
Yeah, well, you may recall from the first edition, it's broken up into individual practices, and each
Hmm.
practice is only 5 to 10 pages. So it's very digestible. And it's all written so that you can read it in any order. So, in a way, it's a recipe book because beginners need recipes. But it's also one thing that I did in the new edition that I'm really happy with. The first edition had all the sort of here's how you customize at the back of the book. And I wasn't very happy with how that was done.
Mm.
So for the second edition, every single practice has a section at the end saying, here are some experiments you can conduct. Once you've figured out how this practice works, here's what the practice is really about. Here's different ways you can do it. Agile is about changing and experimenting and trying and adapting. So every single practice talks about that. And that's one of the sort of structural improvements I'm really proud of in the new edition.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I haven't read it cover to cover yet, so I didn't really discover the new wave. Actually, when I look at it, when I flip through it, I could have seen it, but I didn't realize it. Well, I never put them covered next to each other.
Yeah.
But I'm asking the question because I have both versions of the original book from Ken Beck, and for me, they're really two different books. I like them both, but they're really two different books. And I
Mhm.
find it a shame that most new people cannot, new people new to Agile cannot buy the first edition anymore. And so
Mm.
that's why I'm asking, because I think there is value in so I don't, I again, like I haven't read your second edition. I don't know how much I would miss the first edition. But for Ken's book, for me, it was really like I would like people to read both books. Uh, and it's his first edition is also the one that I don't dare to give anymore to other people because I'm afraid I might lose it
Yeah.
because it's so hard to find back. Um,
Yeah,
but
I
yeah.
know what you I know what you mean. The first edition and second edition of Kent's books are very different. I think mine's more of a strict upgrade
Mm.
in that the second edition of my book is doesn't really lose anything that was in the first edition. There was a couple of things that became so widespread that I didn't feel like it was necessary to include it. Like the first edition
Mm.
talks about version control. The second edition, it's kind of assumed now that people are using version control, but it wasn't back in 2007. There were a lot of people still using Visual Source Safe or just editing files.
You
Um,
say source safe as yeah, but at that time people still considered it as a source control system, but you
yeah,
say yeah, not. I like the way you put that because yeah, I agree there. Although I've used it for a while, yeah. Um, and I've been on a team where actually I was told not to use a source control system, so I literally wrote my own batch files to make sure that I have copies of every. Yeah, basically I had a batch file that would copy the sources from that day to a separate folder just to have some kind of versioning system yeah
mhm.
to go back to older systems. It's insane that you can think that people would still consider it normal less than well maybe 10 years ago already, but less than 20 years ago about source control systems not using.
Yeah, so that's the kind of stuff that was taken out,
Yeah, I understand.
and most I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything specific um, that you really cared about that was in the first edition that wasn't in the second. And what I've added in its place is a lot of material about change and change management and adoption that wasn't in the first edition. There's a whole new chapter on scaling. I've got now mob programming, also known as ensemble programming, although Woody Zool has sort of put a stake in the ground for software teaming, which I think is a great name. Um, that's in the book now. I've got continuous deployment in the book, which wasn't in the first edition, and evolutionary system architecture. So
And
I think it's a
psychological
straight upgrade.
safety, the thing I talked about with Hita, I think that's also new in the book. Huh? Psychological
Yeah, yeah,
safety, you didn't
psychological
have it.
safety. Hmm.
This is in there as well. So that's just a few things that are worth reading it again, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, and Diana Larson wrote a great section on team dynamics and shared leadership, which she also, you probably know this, but she has a new book out called Lead Without
Leading.
Blame that
Exactly.
uh, builds on similar material. I haven't read this yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it.
And by coincidence, tonight, after this conversation, I will actually record a session with Trisha, who's the co-author of that book.
Excellent.
So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
to link everything back together.
Well, say hi
Okay,
to her for me.
I will. I will. Okay, let's jump into that first question. Is that what is something that people usually don't know about you, but has influenced you in who you are?
Yeah. So um, I am a huge nerd. I don't think that's going to be a huge surprise to anybody.
No.
But one thing that is in my background that people aren't typically aware of, and does influence a lot, has influenced a lot of who I am today, is I love role playing games. Uh,
Mm,
when I was a kid, I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. I still play with friends every week today. I love board games as well. And you would think, well, what does that have to do with, agile software development or being effective professional? But there's a lot of skill involved in facilitation when you're playing
mm.
role playing games and leading a role playing game, which is what I like to do. And
Ah, so you were kind of the facilitator because in Dungeons and Dragons, really that's a specific role that what we would call a facilitator in a
yeah,
sense.
well, there's this role of dungeon master or game master, depending on which role you're playing, or a referee. And the job of that person is to sort of keep things on track. And if you really want an effective game, make sure that everybody's getting their chance to shine. And there's a lot of
Mm,
parallels between that and being effective as a servant leader in an organization, or being a coach, or the kind of immersive coaching I do a lot of, which is keeping people on track, having a clear vision of what success looks like, but allowing people to find their own way to that success, coaching them to reach that success. Now, the relationship's a little bit tenuous. I don't go consult with folks and bring my dice with me, but um, I think that interest in sort of being a team collaborator, and
mm.
uh, and helping people by having them take their own leadership roles has always been useful for me. And it's also led to me investigating all kinds of things. I made a game called the Agile Fluency game with Arlo
Mhm.
Belshi, and that was heavily influenced by my experience playing board games and role playing games. And one of the results of that is that people who've played it say it not only is it a good simulation of what it's like to adopt Agile for the first time, it's also a fun game. And I
Mm.
definitely wouldn't have been able to create that, or many of the other things I've done, without that background in games, specifically tabletop games and role playing games.
It brings me back to I don't remember anymore when, but somewhere in 2007, 2000, somewhere between 2007 and 2010, I followed this. No, it was definitely in 2010. I followed this session with Arlo, and I think you were the co-facilitator. A session at Agile 2010. What was it again? Basically, it was role playing about bad things about Agile. I don't remember if you remember that. That was about what did we needed to do. We needed to do there was a game where people were sitting at one side of the room and another side of the room where you would use what's it called, CC cards, so you could actually use it in a waterfall way, and there was a part in an agile way, and it was kind of showing in a funny way. Yeah, well,
Yeah, that
essentially.
sounds like that was actually, I think it might have been 2010, 2011. It was a sort of a parody of Agile that
Yeah,
Arlo and I put on,
exactly.
like a play, um, called Bloody Stupid Johnson Teaches
That's
Agile.
the one, exact. And
Yeah.
that I know it's 2010 because I did a session with Diamond, with Robin Diamond, and I know I was working in 2010 with him, so that's why I know it's 2010.
Mm,
I
yeah.
really
Yeah.
that was my introduction to Arlo. I think I read your book by that time already,
Mm, mhm,
but somehow I kept remembering Arlo linked to that more than you, so I wasn't sure. But yeah,
mhm,
I link you two a lot together. It's fun to see indeed. In Belgium, we also have a few people who are interested in role playing. Erik Talboom is the most well, the person I know most from agile coaches that have done some similar kind of things. Yeah, it seems that a lot of us, well, a lot of us, some people are really going or coming from similar kind of activities. It's interesting to see.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that background, one thing that I found really effective and that I love doing, all my work is experiential learning. So whenever I'm teaching or I'm helping people or I'm coaching or I'm helping people go through a change, it's always based on doing things for real.
Mm.
Learning by doing and making that experience as close to reality as possible. So even in the classroom, I did an Agile boot camp. Uh, it was called I think it was the Art of Agile Development boot camp or something like that, with Diana Larson. And what we
Mhm.
did is in a week, we had people develop software for real using extreme programming in 90-minute
Mm.
iterations. And we did some teaching along the way. But we got 4 90-minute iterations in that session. And that sort of hands-on experiential learning, I find it to be incredibly effective and probably influenced again by that background with with
And when you say 90 minutes, you also have a debrief part in that, I assume, because there's that usually we learn a lot in the debrief part.
Oh, well, the 90-minute iterations were the practical part. And then, of course, there was, we were doing 5 7 hour days.
Oh,
So,
yeah. So, yeah,
so there
okay.
was a lot of other stuff as well.
There's a lot of other stuff in there. So that, yeah, and it reminds me of something that Elizabeth Hendrickson did in her things. She had also, but there was a full week that people were immersed in creating software together. I think a lot of us, well, it's interesting. I had the discussion even today with people talking about agile. It's all about the mindset. But if I then talk to people, most of us we learned it by doing, by creating habits, and by actually doing. So yes, I agree the mindset is important, but we learn a lot by doing it. And with these small iterations, we come to realize a lot of that stuff. So it's interesting to see that you're also one of the people who are teaching it in that way by doing it. So
Yeah,
that's
the my experience, I first did this with, I was an adjunct professor or Portland State University here in Portland.
mm,
And my co-instructor and I, who is part of the normal facility, we were doing an extreme programming course, and we decided to do it in an experiential way. And that's when I first did these. First we started, I think, with 2 or 3 hour iterations, and then the class shortened them down. But that really solidified my experience that it's not the size of the iteration that matters; it's the number of iterations that matter for learning.
mm,
And yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for, yes, agile is a way of thinking about your work and it's a philosophy, but I don't think you can learn it by simply talking about the mindset. I
I
think
agree.
that's actually a crock. It's baloney. The only way to really learn it is to do it, to put that mindset into practice. Yes, you do have to change your mindset. Yeah, you do need your managers and executives be on board with that mindset. But for the people who are doing the work, they need to change their mindset by changing the way they work, not change the way they work by changing their mindset. It just doesn't work. And I think you see that kind of attitude from people who don't have the ability to do the work and so don't really know how to teach it.
Yeah, I see that, and yeah, but that's basically the discussion I had this today. Okay, let's move to that second question. That if you had not been doing what you've been doing now, what would have become of you?
Well, it's impossible to say, but I did study electrical engineering in college, and when I was in high school, I thought I was going to be a math teacher. So it would definitely be something in STEM. Um, Probably electrical engineering would have been where I ended up. I did study digital circuits, and I was going to be a computer engineer. Might have ended up at a place like Intel, which has a big presence here in Portland. But I'm really happy I didn't, because the quantum mechanics theory of materials class just beat the stuffing out of me in school. So I'm, I find, software development's actually pretty easy. There's not a lot of heavy math unless you're doing some fairly esoteric stuff. Um, and it's ultimately, I think software engineering is about communication. And
Mm,
I've always been an avid reader, and that could have been a different answer to the question of, what's something people don't know about me. I'm a better reader and writer, I think, than I am a mathematician, and that ability to communicate, I think, is actually what really matters in software and most software engineering, because you're communicating with the other people in your team using the language of the code. Computer doesn't care. All it cares about is ones and zeros. The actual software, the code, that language, it's effectively a human language. It's formal enough that a computer can understand it, but really it's a tool for communicating with each other.
Yeah, it's really, but yeah, one of the things, I don't remember who wrote it, but you write code once and you will read it multiple times, and so you need to write it that you and the people that you're working with can easily understand it. That's the goal, and
Yeah.
it's about that understanding. I want to zoom into a little bit that you said I'm a good reader, or so what does that mean for you to be a good reader?
Oh, I don't know if that was the right terminology. When I took my SATs, which is the standardized testing that we do here in the United States
Mm.
before going to college, I got a higher score on the reading section, or the sort of reading and writing section, than I did in the mathematical section. That's what I meant. But I've been an avid reader ever since I was very young. I used to read a book every night before bed. Um, I mean,
And
these
how
were,
long did you do this?
oh, it'd take an hour or two. A lot of these
No,
books are
I
books
mean,
that,
for how long period did you do this, reading one book a day?
oh, I mean, I just did it for fun, and sometimes multiple books a day ever since I learned to read effectively.
And did that affect your schoolwork, for example, or anything else?
No, not really. I wouldn't say so, no.
I'm asking because I did the exact same thing when I was 13 to 5. I did this for 2 school years, and it did affect a lot of my my school abilities because I had to repass exams in the holidays.
Uh,
Because basically I was, yeah, for me, and it became really unhealthy because I really wanted it. It became some kind of scoring. So basically, I learned there that metrics are really bad because at some point I really wanted to finish one book a day. It didn't matter how big the book was. So if that was a thick book, I would read until 4 or 5 in the
mm,
morning, and of course had to get up at 7, which is automatically, or you can imagine, really bad because I was really tired in school at that
right.
point. So that really, yeah, it's so I learned a lot about unhealthy habits at that time. But like you say, even today, put me somewhere and there is a book in my sight, I might start reading it without realizing it, and people might have to bring me back to earth to say, "Wait a minute, you picked up a book again." I So that's something I see a lot in myself. So I see recognition there on reading it. And
Mm.
when you nowadays when you read, is that how would I say it? Is that all over the place? Is it more fiction, non-fiction? How does that? Is there a?
I've always read for pleasure. You know, when I was reading a book a day, it's not because I had any particular goal to read a book. It's just because I
Mm,
enjoyed it. I've always been sort of an indifferent student. I'm much more of a self-directed learner. I don't do well in classroom settings, so I
mm.
wouldn't say that the the reading harmed my ability to learn. But I've never been a great student to begin with. Um, but in terms of reading, I've always read for pleasure. I don't read a lot of nonfiction
Mhm.
outside of what I need for my professional work. Although I know you're going to ask this later on, but I might as well bring it up now. Um, there is a blog I've really been enjoying that's nonfiction, called A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, which is by Brett Devereaux, and he's a history professor. And he talks about a lot of historical concepts, particularly in Roman times, and how that connects to popular culture, like movies and books and so forth. And I just find it fascinating, and he's a great writer.
Yeah, that's a little bit indeed why I asked the extra question because I thought, okay, that might be linked to that. Okay, let's move to that third part of the question. That third question: what is your biggest challenge, and why is it a good thing for you?
Yeah, this is like an interview question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm I'm terribly stubborn. I'm really stubborn, and I want things to be done well. I care less
Mm,
about the appearance of things and more about the substance of things, which means that I in all my work, what I want to see is I I want to see things done well. And
Mhm.
that has meant sort of me figuring out, well, what does done well mean? And ultimately I've come down to, well, there's three types of success I want to see in the companies I work with. I want to see business success, and I want to see technical success, so high internal quality, and I want to see personal success. I want to see an environment where people thrive. So when I say things done well, that's what I'm talking about. I don't actually care how we get there. It can be agile or it can be not. But if it's not achieving a good outcome, then we need to
And a good outcome for these three axes.
yes,
That's what
yes.
I'm hearing.
And figuring out what that means is part of the work.
And
So
how does that mean also when you create something? Because when you create something and put it out in the world, I can imagine if you really want it to be good, that it's hard to let go if you're not ready yet for quality. Or how does that work for you?
I mean, I am a little bit of a perfectionist, but one of the things that Agile has done for me that's been really wonderful is that it's given me the ability to work incrementally. In the
Mm.
90s, before I discovered Agile, um, I I did have this strong perfectionism, and I had this idea for sort of this cockamamie weird operating system language thing that I played with for years, and eventually gave it up because um, I realized that this big bang approach that I had thought was the right way to work, and had sought out companies that work that way. The more I saw it in action, and the closer I saw people doing it to sort of the by the book way, the worse it was. And that's when I discovered Agile is having this experience. Well, this just does not work. So today I still put I still care about doing things well, even in the things I put out in the world, but I'm willing to do it in an experimental and iterative way.
Because you know that if you release it this week, and if you're not happy next week, you can still iterate on it and create a better version of it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, one of extreme programming's values was courage. And I think it comes
Mm.
back to courage, being willing to sort of put yourself out there. If you can put something out and learn from it, then that is value too, even if it's not done. In my book, I talk about valuable increments as what we want to release. And I used to call them minimum marketable features from a book called Software by Numbers, but now we call them valuable increments. These are the things that we can release that actually have meaningful value to the organization. Um, and there's three kinds of valuable increments. There's increments that have direct value, and you do need those to be sufficiently good for the market that you're pursuing, whatever that is. And that sufficiently good is going to depending on what your market is like. If you're Apple, sufficiently good is a pretty high bar because they're doing a mass market retail, and they have a reputation to uphold. But if you're doing internal vertical market software or software for internal stakeholders, as we've all seen, that software sufficiently good is not a very high bar, but it's still good enough. So that's direct value. But there's also learning value. There's also putting something out or doing something primarily for the purposes of learning how you should change your plans. And there's also option value, doing something so that you have the option to do either this or that. And there's a lot of different types of value. And it's not all about putting out a polished experience.
And how is that then when you learn all of that in Agile to publish a book? Because a book, when you publish it, it feels like it's finished. Because by the time that you wrote this book, there wasn't. I don't think that even in 2007 there were options to release a digital book or something like that. So these days with Leanpub, people can actually create a book and then create a new version basically half an hour later. But with your book, that was not possible. So how was that for you to then release the book where you kind of knew that, okay, the next update will be years, even if you think about a second?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And the answer is the book that you have, the book that you bought, is not the first version of the book. Um, even for the first edition, but also for the second edition, um, uh, as I wrote the book, I published it online for the
Mhm.
entire world to see. The first edition and the second edition were written in source code. The first one used Perl doc, and the second one used ASCII doc. and I have a program that I wrote that automatically converts that to HTML. So as I wrote the book, I put the sections up on my website. I solicited feedback from my mailing list. There were over 100 people on the mailing list for the second edition, and including some heavy hitters in the industry who gave me a lot of great feedback. And so I put it out there, and I listened to that feedback, and I revised in some cases 3-4 times before before I had it locked down. And of course I revised. I'd write it, I'd read it myself and revise before putting it out. So it was a highly iterative process. And the frozen version that people get is the result of that process. And it looks
Mm.
like it was sort of, flung, fully formed from the head of Zeus, but that's not at all what happened.
No, and I'm not sure. I read a few books in that time. I think Thinking in Java was written in a similar kind of way around that time or a little bit earlier. But I still I hear about a lot of people that definitive version, that printing version, it feels very hard for a lot of agilists in the sense that they say, okay,
Yeah.
you can write iteratively, and then all of a sudden there is a version, and of course the moment it comes to you, that first printed version, I think probably in the first 10 minutes, you will see some things like, damn it, I wanted to change this or that. So that's why I was asking about, yeah, the perfectionist in you. How hard is that to do these kind of things?
Yeah, well, when I said that I want things to be done right, I actually am not a perfectionist.
Mm.
So I don't have that problem. I'm Yeah, there were some errors and typos in the print edition, and I just O'Reilly uses Git to store the source code for their book, so I just submitted a patch, and it was print on. They did it in a sort of print on demand way, so the next printing had the fixes, and the ebook had the fixes, but it didn't really bother me. When I say that I want to see things done right, what I mean is that um, the reason that's a flaw, uh, although it is sort of an interview flaw where there's always a good thing, right? But the reason that's a flaw is because there are people out in the world, and there's a lot of people out in the world that want to hire somebody who will sort of wave the magic wand and say, okay, you're blessed, you're agile now. And I will
Hmm.
not work with those people. Um, if you work with me, you're making a commitment to really make a difference in your organization, either a small one or a big one. And it's not going to be a perfectionist type of thing. We're going to solve the problems that you're actually facing, and we're going to do it in a way that's a incremental improvement and not not a
So no big
perfect.
plan up front, but this is how we're going to install Agile.
I
And
mean, I have a lot of experience, so I have a playbook. I know things that work, and I will look at your organization and help you, help customize what works for you. But uh, what I won't do is, people, for example, training departments come to me and say, "We want your training," and I say, "For what?" And they say, "Well, we want a story writing workshop," and I say, "Well, who wants it? Why do they want it?" And some organizations, a lot of organizations, the people who are trying to buy that training don't actually know the answer, and they're not the ones who are
that that you
receiving
should
it.
be talking to it.
Right.
Yeah, you really want to talk to the real customers in a sense.
Exactly. And if they won't let me talk to the real customers, or if I talk to the real customers and they say, "Well, we just need it because we've been told we need it," um, I'll often say, "Look, I can't help you because what I'm here to do is make a difference, and what you're looking to do is spend money." Um, and I'm sure there are people out there who will want to take your
Want
money,
to.
but that's not me.
But that's a hard kind of thing when people are throwing money at you, and well, it's a good thing because you're standing for your values, which I
Yeah.
understand. But at the same time, I can imagine that for a lot of people, when people are throwing money at you, and sometimes the larger organizations are throwing a shit lot of money at people, then it's tempting to then say, okay, I'll give you the course or whatever, but that's not who you are.
Yeah.
You really don't
Yeah.
want to.
I mean, I think if you look at the state, I've been in the Agile community for a long time. 1999, like I said, was my first experience with Agile, and 2000 is when I got involved in the broader community. I posted on Ward Cunningham's original wiki, and Alistair Coburn saw some of the stuff that I wrote and lived in the same city I did, and I joined his roundtable discussion. So I've been part of this community for a long time. I've seen it grow from a grassroots movement of passionate people who wanted to make a difference into frankly, the evolution has been sad. I've seen a lot of people who are in it to just make a quick buck, people who don't know what they're doing, teaching people what the wrong things. I've seen things like SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, which have been sort of taking the author's original stuff, which isn't particularly agile, rebranding it and selling it in a very cynical kind of way. Um, you see that also with the Scrum certified trainers. There are some very good Scrum trainers out there, and there's some who are in it to make a buck. And those that progression is, I think, to be expected and natural, but it makes me sad.
Yeah, it's a little bit what Jerry Weinberg said. So the wider you spread it, the thinner it gets, and that's a little bit. And if you
Right.
throw money on it, it yeah makes it spread even thinner and faster, thinner or broader. Yeah, so that's
Yeah,
definitely.
he called it the law of raspberry jam in his book. It's in his book, The Secrets of Consulting. But in the next edition, or the second edition of that book, or I think it was called More Secrets of Consulting. Now, Jerry Weinberg is a guy who knows how to market, or knew how to
Mhm.
market. So he didn't make a second edition because he's smarter than I am. Uh, he made More Secrets Consulting. And that one he had the law of strawberry jam, which is that you can spread it thin, but there's still lumps. So I guess I want to be one of those lumps. I want to be somebody who's still fighting the good fight and trying to stand up for doing things rigorously and well, without the formality of the waterfall processes, but with real, tangible, meaningful outcomes.
Yeah, well, and I really like it because indeed, in more secrets of consultancy, I think the question is from someone, what about you, about a consultant? And he says, well, me as a person, I cannot spread thin because I am one person and I keep my values the way I want to keep them. And that's a little bit why I brought it up, because that's how it felt that you're reacting as well, indeed.
Mhm.
Okay, I hear a lot of passion and a lot of drive. So let's explore this a little bit. Do you know where that drive is coming from?
Yeah. I mean, so obviously what drives me, I think has been really clear, is making a real difference in
Hmm.
organizations. Um, and I just love it, which is why I do tend my work tends to be immersive coaching and consulting. So I will help people. Um, Early on, I did sort of XP immersion coaching with teams. These days, I'm using something called FAST, which we can talk about later. And I'm doing scaling work. So I'm helping organizations figure out how to solve communication issues between teams in their organizations. But it's all about getting their hands on, getting my hands dirty, and making a real difference and doing it in a way that sticks with people. Because it's really hard to get people to change their habits. People talk about change management. Well, that's what this is about: is changing habits
Mm.
and changing the day to day. But that's what's required to make a real difference. And training is insufficient on its own to make that kind of difference. It can inspire, but it generally doesn't make a substantial difference in habits without a lot of follow-up work.
Yeah, and I hear basically it's a similar kind of thing that you're doing now, but then at a different level. Where XP, the thing that you did with the extreme programming, things is really working at team level. And what I'm hearing now is that okay, I've kind of see that in organizations the problems are more between the teams. So I'm helping out at organizational level or between teams and how they can better communicate. To scale better or to make it work better. Is that a nice way of putting, or well, a different way of looking at it? Or
Yeah, I think, I mean, as I've become better known and as my experience has developed, I've sort of the people who hire me have moved up in the organization.
Mhm.
So, some of the people I've worked with are now in higher leadership roles, and they're calling me back. And so I'm being hired by CTOs and VPs of engineering and chief product officers and so forth. And so the problems they're dealing with are different than the problems I was solving. But I'm still,
Yeah.
I mean, my
But you
tagline is,
still hands dirty, that because
yeah,
that's what you say. You're still in the mud, huh?
that's right. So, for
Doing it.
example, a client that I'm talking to right now, they had me do an analysis of their organization last year.
Mhm.
And I saw what I see in a lot of organizations, which is this sort of kind of us versus them between product and engineering. But when I dug down into it, one of the causes, it was sort of a self-reinforcing loop. So there was no one cause, and there never really is. But one of the things that was reinforcing this loop was that um, engineers were spending a lot of time waiting for their software to build. Like that's a very nitty gritty thing. But
Hmm.
I observed some teams doing their work, and one of them I saw them, they were spending 7 minutes in 50 minutes of work. They spent 7 minutes waiting for the build to complete. And another team in about an hour of work, they spent almost all of it manually debugging and not actually getting to the work that they had planned. And those were typical behaviors. So when they
And
came
that's
back,
very technical with the teams, actually. Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. And so when they came back to me this year and they said, well, we want test-driven development training. And I said, well, let's go back to that loop that we saw. TDD training isn't going to help you as long as your development builds take a minute, because you
Exactly.
cannot be effective with TDD if you're waiting more than about 10 seconds for that instantaneous build. Because you're in TDD, test-driven development, of course, you are making a small change and then running the build and seeing it fail, and then making a small change and running the build and making it pass, and then making small change to improve the design and running the build and seeing it pass. So you're doing the build constantly, like every minute. And if your build is going to take a minute to run, then that's just not effective. So what I've proposed to them is I said, well, look, let me work with your Angular folks, because they're using a framework called Angular in JavaScript. Let me work with your Angular folks, and we're going to increase the build time from a minute to less than 5 seconds. And so I'm still talking.
Decrease the build time, but increase the building.
Yes, exactly. So I'm talking to the CTO, right? I've got this problem. I need to solve it. But the work I'm doing is right down in the details where it's going to make a real difference. I mean, this improving that build time is going to be a major quality of life difference for everybody. And it will allow them to actually start taking smaller steps, which will decrease the amount. When you decrease the size of your steps, you decrease the number of things that go wrong in any particular test. So now you can find your problems sooner. You can fix them more easily because they're obvious by inspection. So you can iterate faster. You're going to have less bugs going into production, and you're going to move faster. So it's going to have beneficial effects through this entire feedback loop that we saw.
And then people will be more interested in adding new tests because now they see that the tests are helping them. Because
Exactly.
before they were, yeah, the more
Yeah.
tests you would add and the more thing they would do, it would actually make the problem worse, the real problem, the build time. And so, yeah, they would not be interested in that.
And if I had just done what they'd asked, they said, can you do TDD training for us? If I had just done that, I could have taught them, I could have done a test-driven development course. I could have even done it on their actual, you know, well, I probably couldn't have done it on their actual code, but I could have done it in an actual Angular and the technologies that they're using. But I could not have done something that they would use, because you can't do TDD if it takes a minute to do a build.
Mhm.
And
I see.
only the most dedicated people, only the people who are already bought into doing TDE will do that.
Yeah, and they don't need the training probably. So
That's right.
that, so I want to go a little bit deeper because you said that your drive is really to make a difference in the world. But I want to see is that, do you have any idea where that desire is coming from? What do you know? I don't want to go too much psychological, but maybe you know where that came from. Is there something that you know about that?
No idea. I
No
have no
idea.
idea.
But
It's
this
just
is what I'm asking because it's something I see with a lot of people, but most of us we don't know. But that's, I wondered if you did know or
yeah.
not.
I mean, it's incredibly satisfying to make this kind of difference. And a lot of the clients I've worked with, because I do this sort of in-depth work, I don't have thousands and thousands of clients. I have a fairly small number of companies that I've worked for. Um, 100, maybe 200, maybe dozens. I don't actually know. I'd have to look it up. Um, but what I can do is I can point back at these cases where I've done, I do small things too. So I'll do like a conference talk for an internal conference or something like that. And those, I don't expect those to make a lasting difference. But for these companies where I've done the in-depth coaching and real work, I can talk to them 5 years later and they'll tell me, yeah, we're still doing that. And that's
Mm,
incredibly gratifying. It's just really satisfying to do something that sticks and works well enough for people that they want to keep doing it.
I can definitely, yeah, that definitely relates to me. If you have people coming back to you after a while and tell you like, okay, this is really that changed my life or that changed my work life or everything. That's definitely. It kind of brings me to that next question. What do you consider your biggest achievement? So
Yeah.
this is basically your moment to brag.
Yeah, well, definitely my children. I've got a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old, and they're wonderful people, um, and I'm very proud of them. But in my professional life, it the, I do feel like those companies that I've done the in-depth work with that have stuck with it. I'm very proud of that. There was a company in Philadelphia that I worked with years and years and years ago. I don't even know how long ago it was. I think it was before the first edition of the book. So maybe 2006,
Mm.
maybe it was 2007 or 2008. I don't even remember anymore. Um, but uh, they reached out to me just last year. Um, and I don't remember what the reason was, but we got to talking again. And the person who reached out to me first was actually somebody who came into that organization after I'd left and heard about what I did
So
and
you
had
never
gone,
actually met that person at that organization.
never met him at the organization. And he had
Wow.
gone on to found the Extreme Programming User Group in Philadelphia, which has been enormously influential in the Philadelphia tech scene. So, and that XP user group was based on the extreme programming I taught this company in Philadelphia. And that company is gone. They were acquired by IBM and everybody's left. But the impact of that work has continued on. It's also true for a company in Salem that I worked with in Oregon and a company in Portland. I mean, I have these places that years later they're still doing it, and the ripple effects of what I've done are still going out. That's definitely my biggest achievement. I love doing that.
That's definitely making a dent in the world. Where well,
It is.
if people beyond what you've yeah beyond the people that you met have had a change there. That's indeed a very nice achievement that to be proud
Yeah.
of.
I
Uh,
don't expect to change the world single-handedly. All I want to do is make a difference with the people that I interact with, and if I can do that, then I'm successful in my mind.
Well, yeah, that reminds me of a quote I once heard that the real leaders are the people who are able to create leaders that are creating leaders. So, like you say,
Mm,
you don't want to change the world on your own, but you want to influence some people who are influencing other people, like creating that user group. And so that's the kind of thing where the ripple effect is even more important than just the work that you're doing. Yeah. That's
mhm,
because on your own, well, most of us we're not able to change the world. Yeah, maybe we need a lot more money, or we need, I don't know, create larger kind of things. But I've noticed that a lot of people in the agile community, we really like to make small changes that indeed are creating other people that are creating influence, and that actually scaled much better, if you ask me,
mhm.
in different kind of ways. So I like that. That's, for me, it feels a lot like how you talked about before about the XP in US and in Europe. I feel that there's a big difference, for example, to the conferences in the US where they scale up, became creating a lot of large conferences, where in Europe it feels much more like scaling sideways. Like we have a lot more smaller conferences.
Yeah.
And so that's a different kind of way of scaling and a different kind of way of influencing people.
Yeah, I mean, back in 2004, I think it was, the XP Universe conference and the Agile Development Conference that was founded by Alistair Coburn combined to make the big Agile conference, Agile 2022, Agile 2023. And I think that was a mistake,
Mm,
because uh, as there was this real desire in the early 2000s to bring in to be agile is a big tent. We want to have collaborative cross-functional teams, and so there was this combination and this desire to bring in executives and managers and project managers, and that worked really well for a while. But then, because there was just this one really big venue that was kind of loose in its focus and a lot of money to be made, especially in the late 2000s, early 2010s. Um, we started seeing the people who were proposing and wanting to come and speak because there was money at stake, either
Mhm.
Scrum Master certification, or better yet for them, the ability to sell Scrum Master certifications. And so we saw a lot of the down and dirty, how do we actually do this for real as software developers writing code? That set of skills and that focus, and then eventually those attendees left. And now the Agile conference is uh, got some good material, but all of the how do we build software has gone. There is very, very little technical content, very little how do we actually be effective in doing the thing that we say we're here to do at the Agile conference. And I think that some of that can be, stems back to the fact that Extreme Programming Conference, XP Universe, combined in to make the Agile conference. I think if we still had an XP conference, because XP has a much stronger focus on how do we do the work than say Scrum does or Safe does, I think we wouldn't have lost that emphasis.
Yeah, I recognize that. I see that also. We have XP Day Benelux, where they still have technical content, but year after year, they really have to struggle to find good technical content to find. And these are the sessions that are the least having participants in it because, yeah, most of it is indeed. And I feel, well, maybe not responsible, but I know that I was one of the people who brought in some personal content about leadership at some point back in, I don't know, 2005 or something like that. And then it was needed because then it was all about technical content, but now the balance has shifted to the other direction. And it, for me, it feels like that technical is more moved to, for example, the DevOps yeah, community, so the DevOps conferences that are happening in Germany. You have OOP, which is also things. So there is a few larger ones. We have DevOps, which is also, but it's separate. I mean, there's
Mhm.
no link in it. Yeah, a little bit sad, but at the same time, like you say, we shouldn't bring these into that conference because then we'll make the problem even worse. So
Mhm.
that's the kind of thing that yeah, we definitely need to be very aware about that it's and I've seen the same thing with coaches. You talked already about some coaches who are not really good at and understanding that. And for me, not all coaches should have, for example, in a large company, not all coaches should have technical, but if you have a coaching team of, let's say, 10, 20, I don't know how many people, and none of them, or the not many people have experience with creating software, then you really are missing out on the most important part of it. Because yeah, it's about the doing and creating it, and that understanding it. You just talked about understanding that a build, that it needs to be under 1 minute. If people have never built software, they don't always realize that issue there. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I should mention, just in case anybody's watching this, I'm talking about the development build, not the integration build. So, that fast feedback loop, not the overall build. But yeah, and I want to be clear that there is a lot of value in that sort of facilitative coaching. There's a need for
Mm,
for understanding team dynamics and working with executives and working with managers and helping them understand theory Y management and identifying your bottlenecks and your impediments and figuring out ways to resolve them. There is value in all of these things, and there's value in doing the technical work and doing that effectively. And Agile, I think its original strength was, particularly in extreme programming, trying to marry these two sides and doing it imperfectly. Uh, Nobody's perfect, and extreme programming isn't perfect. But it came closer to recognizing the value of both really effective software coding practices combined with really effective agile planning practices than anything else. And what I try to do in my book is bring that in and also bring in more of the sort of management level and team dynamic stuff that was missing from extreme
mm.
programming.
Yeah, and I remember in the, well, I don't know if you can still call it early, but when I was starting to discover Scrum in 2005, 2006, I remember talking to some of the people who created Scrum and around that. And I was asking about the technical. And I remember that the answer back then was like, we don't need to talk about the technical excellence because extreme programming has covered that. And actually, we're encouraging a lot of people to combine them because that's, you need to have it. And even in that very first book about Scrum, the black one with the color things, there is one sentence about, okay, you need technical excellence. It's just one sentence, but for them it was like, this has been solved already. Yeah, exactly, that's the one. uh,
Yeah.
it's there. It's a one sentence, but it's there as a meaning, like, okay, you need to have that covered because otherwise you can't do it in Scrum. And somehow people seem to have forgotten it and think, no, they didn't want to add it because there was already a good solution and they wanted to add some focus on some other parts. And we
Hmm.
seem to, yeah, these days, a lot of people seem to look at the Scrum side, but then don't know everything that we just been talking about. Okay, let's move on about a personal. Do you have anything, a personal agility tip to share?
Yeah, yeah, I do. People always ask me, how can I help my organization become more agile?
Mm.
And I do have a couple of chapters on, or the whole first part of my book is on that topic. But the reality is that it is far, far easier to join an organization that works the way you want to work than
Mm.
to create change in an organization to move them in the direction that you want to work. So my tip is that if you want to work with a company that's truly agile or is doing extreme programming, find a company that's working the way that you want to, and
Mm.
go join them.
So if you can change the organization, change the organization.
Yeah,
At
yeah,
least,
that's Martin Fowler's saying. But I would go one step further, which is, um, I've been there. I've done that. I've done the change your organization work from the inside. I have a whole series up on it on my website called "Change Your Organization Diary," and it is, in fact, the presentation I gave at one of the early XP Universe conferences was a sort of experience report on that on that. Um, and it's heartbreaking work. So I would say, unless you're in an organization where you really love the people and the work you're doing, just change your organization. Like, go find a place that works the way you want to work, if you can. Now, I know not everybody has that opportunity, but if you really want to change, see an agile way of working, the way to do it is find an organization that's already agile. It's really hard to make these changes from within.
at the same time, that's sad for the world because it means that, yeah, we're going to leave a lot of companies that are not working in the right way. If the people who care about it and leave them, then yeah, that's also sad about it. But I do understand that. I fully agree. It's really hard to change an organization and to make
Yeah.
that
Now,
change happen.
and I'm speaking to people who are, talking about the folks who are working sort of in the trenches. I mean, if you're called a resource, you know, then go find a
Right.
better place. These individual contributors as opposed to team contributors or managers. Um, if you are if you're a manager, if you're particularly if you're a director or senior manager, there are things you can do, like hire people like me, at the risk of being a little mercenary about it. But there is work that you can do when you have enough influence in the organization. But if you're in the trenches doing that work at the bottom up level, unless you have a lot of trust and um, and political capital in the organization, it's very hard to make a difference. However, if you do have that trust and political capital, you want to make that effort, then yeah, check out a book called Fearless Change by Marilyn Manns and Linda Rising. There are other books as well that I think Esther Derby has a book out about organizational change now. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. There is
Seven
work you can do.
effective. Yeah, I can. Yeah, yeah. I know which book you mean. I will put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Book from Esther both and Linda and Marilyn. Indeed. Well, I wanted to bring that up because you say change your organization or leave it, but at the same time, the work that you're doing is exactly that what you say, don't try to do it. But that's because you have already been there, that you know it, and that you're actually, you have the, or you make sure that you have the how's it called, people call you to do that, and if you don't have that mandate, that's the word I was looking for, then you
Mhm.
basically say, I'm not going in. And I think that's the big difference. If you're there as a small part in the trenches, then you don't have that mandate to change it, because the rest of the organization typically doesn't want that change, and then it's impossible. If you're down there and deep in the trenches, you really need that mandate. And I think I link it back to what you said earlier as well, is that even if they try to hire but don't give you that mandate, you don't even try, because that's exactly the problem that these people have, that they yeah, you say it won't work. And I've seen that so many times in the companies, and I've been burned by it. Asked to do some things, and when you don't talk to the right person, and you don't get at a high enough level where you do get that mandate to make that change, you're just hired to, or at least you discover it when you enter, that you're actually just hired to do a certain small part, but that is more yeah, window dressing than really wanting to do that change. Then the best thing to do is leave as fast as possible, because it's not going to help. I
Yeah.
recognize that.
A lot of us, consultants are hired to sort of sprinkle magic pixie dust
Just
around.
exactly.
But, I've been a consultant since late 2000. I've been doing this for over 20 years now, and I can tell you, I mean, the secret to success, I can tell you from the beginning whether or not I'm going to be successful in doing significant change in an organization, assuming that's what I'm hired to do. It's not the only kind of thing I'm hired to do, but if people hire me to help them with a significant change, I can tell you right now what the deciding factor is going to be.
Mm.
If if I can talk to decision maker in the organization, in a really large organization, um, it might be VP. In smaller organizations, it will be CTO, or generally the CTO or CPO. If I can talk to them and I can see that they're enthusiastic about the change, we've got half of what we need. And that's enough for me to agree to make a proposal and to be paid to start the work. And then the very first thing I do is I go talk to the people who have to do the actually make the change their work. So the folks who are in the trenches doing the real work of the organization. And I talk to them and I find out, what do they care about, and are they willing to make a change? And if those two things happen, then we'll be successful. I can make that work. I guarantee it. I literally guarantee it. My work is fixed price, and I put a guarantee. I will keep working with you until you agree with achieve the outcomes that you've said you will. Or a certain amount of time has passed, because I don't want to sign myself into indentured servitude. But that's never happened. We've always succeeded.
Yeah,
Um,
it's really, it's the both. It's some people think it's bottom up, it's top down. No, you need both parts of the organization. And
yeah.
if it's a large organization, you need that middle part as well, because they might be in the middle of that. But you
Well,
definitely need both parts of it.
middle management tends to be a common point of resistance, and that's partly because the role of middle management is to maintain the organization status quo. They're the ones who keep the organization moving forward. Executives are sometimes off doing silly things and sometimes off doing important things that are strategic, but either way, they're not the ones keeping the organization going forward. And the people
Mm.
in the sort of doing the work, they're making things happen, but they're not the ones that are sort of they're not the ones who are typically deciding who to hire or when to hire, and making sure that that knowledge, that organizational culture is maintained going forward. So the role of middle management is to keep the status quo. So, although I've worked with some middle managers who are extremely forward looking and fantastic to work with, many middle managers are worried about, how is this going to affect my job of keeping the company working? And that's, there's a charitable way of looking at this and an uncharitable way. And the uncharitable way is, there's fiefdoms and there's political maneuvering, and you do see that as well. But either way, what you do is you make this change from both sides and squeeze the middle into going along. The thing is with middle management is they're engineers. If they disagree with something, they will go find another place to work.
Mm.
Middle managers will disagree and commit. That's they understand that that's their job, is um, to keep the organization moving. But if a new direction comes down, they're eventually will follow that. So it just takes time, and there's a certain amount of failed initiatives that people see in organizations, particularly ones that um, have been through this many times. Like I know organizations who've done something safe like 3 or 4 or 5 times, and so there's a sort of cynicism that happens at the middle management layer and even
Mhm.
at the engineer layer, um, of, well, this is just yet another thing that we can ignore and it will go away. So you do have to push past that, but eventually you can sort of squeeze the organization from both sides and make the changes you need to make.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding on to. So they're in the middle, and they can make it well, depending on how ready they are for that change. That they can make it easier or harder. And I agree. This is why I also say that sometimes we need to have three, four, maybe five, seven consultants saying the same thing, and gradually people are picking things up. And you might say the exact same thing as the first five people, but somehow it's only after the sixth or the seventh that they start to understand, or they realize everybody's saying the same thing. Maybe there's some value in there, or it starts to click at something else. That's a little bit what I've seen, and I've noticed this myself as well as a consultant. I have a particular idea in mind where I was at the company where there was some middle management that wasn't ready, but actually basically he didn't even have time for me to talk. So at some point it didn't work, and I agreed with the manager that actually hired me to say, well, you know what, there's other consultants, go there, let's swap me, but make sure that that new person that's going in there talks immediately to that manager. That, well, you know what, Eve was the problem, let's avoid this, let's have a conversation, let's make sure that we're connected. And the thing that I was not able to do, having a connection with that person, was actually agreed right up front because of I was the problem. And that kind of helped to move things along because you need to get access to that person. And
Mhm.
that kind of help. And if you're with multiple people in an organization, coaches, and for me, it's like, oh, I don't care that you swap me out. I know that my colleague will say similar things, but at least we get a one step further if we can have access to that other level that we didn't have access to. And I really like also the fact that what you said in the beginning about you need access to that upper management. It reminds me a lot of my father also works as a therapist, and one of the things that he used to say is that once people get to me, once they ask for help, half of their problem is gone. It's something similar. Once they realize we have a problem and they're really committed to solving it, not just okay, I go there because there's somebody else tells me I need to go. No, that doesn't work. It's the same thing. Like if I don't know, a board tells you you need to go agile and you need to hire James, well, probably this won't happen until indeed that CEO or that C-level person is ready to really want to change, not because a
Mhm.
board or an investor wants to do that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that really is there. And sometimes it takes a while and a few consultants before they're ready to make that shift or that thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel bad when I find that a customer is not going to be a fit, because I put a lot of heart and soul in my work, and I want it to succeed. And so putting that amount of effort into something and having it fail is just uh, it's not good for anybody. It's not good for I don't enjoy it. It's not good for my reputation. It's not good for them. It's also not good for them to, go with somebody else and fail in the same way. But and the thing is when people are just looking for the magic pixie dust, they will hire somebody. They will hire somebody that will tell them what they want to hear. Um, but I know that I'll be hearing from them again in 3 years,
Exactly.
4 years. They'll
It
come back.
will fail, and sometimes they might think back, oh, wait a minute, this is exactly happening what James said us, what would happen. And the fact that you tell them, no, you're not ready. I was actually hired in the current client. I was hired by the same manager that interviewed me like 5 years before. And I walked out of that interview and I called my wife and said, look, this is not going to happen because there is no match. And the exact well, I was brought in some years later, and yeah, there was an immediate match, and this person exactly said like we were not ready. And of course, I've involved as well, so I've moved on, so I've learned some other things. So it's not just them that moved on
Mhm.
and learned, but both of us we learned. But there was no match, and so that it would have made me horrible, miserable, and them as well. So definitely, that's exact same thing. Um, and that's the nice thing. Saying no, even if it's from both sides, it doesn't really matter who says no. If there's no match, it's horrible to work together. It's much
Yeah.
better to wait for that match.
I
And I
one of
think
my
that's a good. Yeah, go ahead.
one of my biggest engagements, they had asked me to do a substantial amount of work. It was going to be a lot of money, and I wanted it to be successful. And when I got in there, so the person who hired me had the budget to bring me on, and we actually signed the contract. And my work is fixed price, so they agreed to pay me the full amount over time. But as I said, once I have to see that high level engagement, but then I have to see what's happening in the organization to make sure that it's going to be successful. And once I started getting in there, I saw some serious problems. And I came back to that executive committee, which was their CFO and their basically their entire C-suite. And I said, this is what's going on, and this is what you're going to have to do in order to be successful with this. And and they said, well, we don't want to do that. And I said, okay, well, we're not going to be successful. Um, and and we need to stop this. And eventually they came back to me and said, well, we're canceling. In the contract was written, either one of us can choose to stop. And I say, well, think it over. I'd like to do this with you, but we really, if uh, they had the details aren't important, but
Mm.
um, I, I said, I'd like to work with you. Think it over. We really need to do this in order for this to be successful. They came back to me and said, well, um, we want to cancel. We were going to exercise the escape hatch because we're worried that our teams are going to get your attitude. It's like, I think that was the right choice. And to this day, I am very happy I didn't end up working with them because it was a lot of money, but I guarantee my work, I could have been working with them for a long time without success, and just making everybody miserable.
Yeah, that doesn't help. And then like you say, if they don't like that attitude, because even you say this is a problem, and they don't like to have that mirror, because that basically is what they're saying. They don't look like to have a mirror that's showing them their problem. Well, then we cannot go for the success.
One thing that's often a shock to folks, who, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, everybody wants to hire somebody to change other people. They're always a little bit surprised when they learn that they have to change themselves as well.
Mm.
And I do some of that investigation in the initial conversations before the proposal even goes out. But that's what had happened in this case, that they needed to change uh, their management expectations, at the executive level, basically, s- you know, be willing uh, to use an agile approach to doing their work,
Mm.
from a management perspective, and they weren't willing to do that.
And then like you say, then it stops. That is indeed
Yeah,
the best thing.
yeah. It came
Let's
down to
move to
governance
that.
in the end.
Yeah, let's move to that next question. What have you learned about remote working? And you were talking already a little bit about it before, so I don't think you did your first remote work with when COVID hit, but what did you learn along the way with the remote working?
Yeah. So prior to COVID, I was very much on in the camp that said agile is successful when your teams are co-located. And of course, we had COVID. Everybody had to forced to work remote, and and I've learned since then, I think you can actually have teams that are successful that are not co-located. I do think that, um, everything else being equal, a co-located team is going to be more creative and more effective than a non-co-located team. But when you take into the account how hard it is to hire everybody in a same location, the costs of both environmentally and personally of commuting every day back and forth, cost of housing and everything else, I think remote work can actually be a superior alternative to working together. Um, and So I've learned a lot about how to do this effectively, and one of the things that I've learned is that you need to have a tool that you can use to make shared shared bounded context diagrams. So you need a tool like Miro, is the one I know, or people use Mural, but basically a shared whiteboarding tool where you have these group conversations with the tactility of working at a whiteboard. You can't just be faces on a monitor. Uh, that's really important, that you actually have that ability to share ideas by moving them around and work simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of tools these days that are officially called collaboration tools, which are really more communication tools, and we really need real collaboration tools where we can actually work together. And I think if you talk back about when the Agile Manifesto was written, there were no real of these tools. I remember in 2005, I think, my first remote team, we made a diagram in the restaurant on a napkin, and we
Mhm.
found it so important that we scanned it in and we sent it over to the other side where they used paint to change a little bit, and we had a conversation back and forth. uh, but basically that was what we needed. We needed one way or another to make some drawings. And
Mhm.
again, 2005, we didn't have smartphones, so it was not just possible to write something on a whiteboard and then send pictures over. We really need to find a different kind of way to do that. So really scan in the that napkin and stuff like that. But that's basically what we noticed that we were missing. We need tools to do that kind of thing. And yeah, I think we've moved along, and a lot of that has been improved in the last 2 3 years. But I think we're just seeing the surface of doing that kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
And still, even today, I see so-called teams that don't deliberately design their team interactions. When you're in person, it's easy to create healthy team interactions. When you're
Mhm.
remote, you have to be very intentional about it. So that's where you need a tool like Miro for the shared whiteboard. You need to have effective communication policies around your group chat. You need to have, I like a three screen model. I need a screen that I put the person's face on and I look at them when I'm talking to them, and a
Mhm.
screen where I work, and maybe a tablet where I can draw. And I want to see that all set up very intentionally to create a healthy collaborative work environment. Because what I do see in a lot of these remote teams is a return to the multiple, lots of teams of one person. They call it a
Mhm.
team, but it's actually 6 people working independently, and, the work is sort of assigned out,
Disperse.
often by a product owner or a manager, and I don't think that's a very effective model either. But the work is assigned out, everybody works individually, and maybe they stand up, but they're all doing their own thing. They're not truly collaborating. And one thing that we know is that collective code ownership and collective ownership of the work is really, really effective, and it makes a huge difference in the effectiveness of a team. And so but you have to design your remote work environment to support that.
I really like that part because designing what the one of the things I see is that when we work in the office, we actually have a lot of things that we learned about working in the office. That the example I always give is when I started working, I had to learn that going to the coffee machine was a good way to talk to other people. Somebody had to tell me this, or I picked it up, and then somebody else told me like, if you want to work with a different department, you can actually have a coffee one floor up because that different department is over there, and you can so that these are tips and tricks that I learned along the way.
Mhm.
And remote work, we don't have these tips yet. We haven't learned it. uh, Stupid things like you go into an office, into a meeting, and if you're there and you're early, then you just chat a little bit with the people who are there. Remote, somehow that doesn't happen. People are all happy that, oh, remote, we're early, and we all keep working on our own because we are so much in meetings that this is the only moment that we can work a little bit, and we don't take that time, that 5 minutes while everybody's arriving, to chat to each other. Stupid things like that. We really have to relearn the remote version of that kind of collaboration and interaction. And indeed, when you talk about the tools, that's even worse because we need to design, set up. I really like the your three screen thing, that the fact that you can draw on a tablet and integrate that into that way of working, and then at least other people may should be able to draw and pick up on that.
Mhm.
That's the kind of thing that we need to do much more. I really
Yeah.
like that you bring that up.
And managers need to pay attention to the team dynamics. It's so easy to feel disconnected from people as humans. And, we've seen online communication tends to be really confrontational. And that's because it's easy to dehumanize the person
Mm.
at the other end. So, yeah, you need to figure out ways to get people to physically be together, to learn to see that the person is an actual human.
When you say
And
physically, you mean emotionally? Feels more
no, I
like.
mean actually physically get together.
Ah, yeah, okay. So see each other and bound and that kind of way. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, yeah.
That's kind of thing. Right. Glad I asked to make sure that I understood that correctly. Let's move to this question. I think you actually have a lot of things. What's a book that you read? What are books that you advise people to read?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a huge number of books on my shelf that are agile related and professional related, and I don't know where I'd even begin to recommend one of those. But I've got a huge bibliography in the back of my book. Um, the the last book I've read is not so much a book, but it's this blog by Brett Devereaux,
Mhm.
the history professor. I'm reluctant to call him a history professor because that makes him sound dry and boring, but it's actually just this fascinating blog about various aspects of pop culture. His most recent article was about the video game Victoria 3 by Paradox International, I think is the name of the company. Anyway, it's a one of those historical world kind of a world conquest game, except it's more about the technology and social aspect as well as the wars. Um, they have a lot of these historical simulations that are a lot of fun. Anyway, he digs into it and he analyzes it and he talks about, well, here's what was really happening in this stage of history, and here's what the game does, and here's what we can learn from this. I find it absolutely fascinating. You can find it at a collection of unmitigated pedantry is the name of it, and it's at acoup.blog. Um, and
Well, I
it's a lot
put
of
the
fun.
link in the show notes that people can click on it as well. And so if you want to talk about one of these, so we already talked a little bit about extreme programming, the two versions. Is there another book that's on your mind that you say, okay, this is still interesting that people usually don't know anymore because it might be an older book or something that really made a huge difference for you?
Yeah, I'd say a book that has fallen off of people's radar but was enormously impactful for me is this book by the Poppendix, Lean Software Development.
That one.
Um, it is it's really foundational. It describes, I think, does better job than any other book about describing why Agile works.
Mm.
Prior to that book, there was a lot of books around how do you do Agile. I mean, there was a whole series of extreme programming books about how do you do extreme programming. Um, but Lean Software Development, I think, was the first book that I read that sort of made it all come together in my head about, well, why does this work? And bringing in the other things I had read about software management and making it all fit together.
Yeah, I really like that book as well. It was, and there were, yeah, basically it came in a sense outsiders that not in that community yet when they wrote their book, or at least that's how it felt to me.
Well,
But they.
they were, and that they were invited to the meeting in Snowbird,
Mhm.
I believe, but didn't go for some reason, weren't available. So it's unfortunate that we didn't see the Poppendix on as signers of the manifesto. It would have helped the diversity a little bit, if nothing else.
Yeah. Well, there's in one of the conversations I had with Alistair, he talks also indeed about the creation of the manifesto and actually some other people. He didn't mention the Poppendiks, but he mentioned some other women that were actually invited to that manifesto, and like you said, that were not able to join at that time.
Yeah.
Okay, that's and indeed, yeah, we can talk. There's already been a lot of talk about that diversity in that meeting at that level, but that's history. The people were there. That the people were there. That's a little
Yeah.
bit how things moved on.
Well, I think one thing that people don't realize is that events like the meeting at Snowbird are happening all the time. People are always getting together and having conversations and trying to create big things or not trying to create big things. Um, and it's sort of luck of the draw which of them actually turn out. So, if you're invited to one of these something like this, you have no idea if it's going to be what's going to come of it, and more often than not, nothing will come of it. So it's easy to look at it in hindsight and say, "Oh wow, well, you know, they should have gone to this event, or they should have been careful to invite a more representative cross section of humanity." But reality is that the way to bet going into it is that nothing was going to come out of it. And
Mm.
in a sense, nothing did come out of it. They were there for 2 days and they came up with 40 words, um, and got some skiing in. So, you know,
Yeah, and it's only afterwards that it took the world by storm, because it was the right thing at the right time.
that's right.
And indeed, and not even everything was finished in that weekend. A lot of that was some of the words were created afterwards. That's indeed. And Alistair indeed talks about the fact that indeed he created some other things, like the interdependencies for project management and stuff like that. And the Agile Manifesto was really the only one that really took the world by storm on some of these things that he started. So
Yeah.
that's he himself that told already, indeed, that nice example about you start some things and you have no idea where it's going to end up with. That's indeed the thing. That's a little bit, yeah. That's what you say. That's what life is about. Let's move on. And so, what's a question that I didn't ask that you want me to answer, or that you want to answer as well?
Yeah. The question you didn't ask is, what do we do about these large organizations that have a lot of teams working
Mm,
on the same set of code? How do we effectively get those folks working together? And that's a question that a lot of the people I'm working with now are struggling with, or rather, they're calling me because they have. I mean, people call this scaling, but I try to avoid the word scaling because it's got
mm,
so much baggage. But they've got, organizations with, say, 200 engineers, and all working on the same product, and they're grinding to a halt. And maybe the larger organization has even more than that, but then you start getting into portfolios. But 200 engineers all working on the same product, how do you do that effectively? They're grinding to a halt because the cost of communication and the delays between teams and the errors and bottlenecks that form are just killing them. I've come across something called FAST, fluid scaling technology, which I have had some experience with, very successful experience. I was very pleased with how it turned out, especially given the constraints of the organization that I was working with. That appears to be a superb answer to that question. And it's also the most agile approach to this question. So you have things
mm,
like SAFe, which are sort of uh, rational unified process with the agile name slapped on top. Um, Very cynical, very much, let's grab some money out of the people who want agile but don't actually want to be agile. Um, and you've got things like large scale Scrum, which is more popular in Europe, I think, than the US, um, and is a solid approach. And you have sort of the basic approach that people use, which is component teams. So we've got a front end team, we've got a back end team. This is just sort of what everybody
mm,
knows. And you have the the more less well, it's not really the less approach. You have this idea of feature teams, which has been, I think, fairly well defined in this team topologies book, where we're going to try to create autonomous teams. But other than less, these all have the same problem, which is that designing your organization in these ways is very brittle. And it's not particularly agile. I've done this sort of work for years. It takes this kind of a big bang, top down effort to redesign the organization in the way that you want. Fast is an exercise that involves, it's a lot like open space technology in that you
mm,
have people form their own teams on a regular basis so that you can have 50 people operating as a single virtual team. You can actually have 50 people all working together effectively on the same product, and they can do it remotely. And it's something you can introduce to an organization where you take two teams and you have those two teams work together without impacting the rest of the organization. You can grow from there. Or at least that's my theory. I have not done that yet, but
mm,
having done fast in another environment, I don't see how that would be a problem. Uh, it is not yet mainstream. It was created by Ron Cortell, at Primavera, health insurance company, I believe. Um, and there's a number of people, and myself included, who are experimenting with it. We're seeing really good results. And I think what it's going to do as it grows in popularity is you're going to be able to see these organizations have 50 people working together effectively rather than 5 people working together effectively. And that's going to change the nature of what it means to have many people working together on the same product.
Wow, that sounds really promising.
Mhm.
And you mentioned a lot of things like the yeah, open source and open, yeah, I
Open
see a
space.
lot of sorry, open space, indeed, the idea of having yeah, the law of 2 feet and all these kind of things where people actually, yeah, you make it about counting, make it about people that count and not just counting the heads.
Mhm.
Making heads that count and not counting heads, that's the sentence I was looking for.
Mhm.
Which is indeed what we need to do that. And that's what we've seen. And for many people, including myself, when I first heard about open space technology, that the how do you do conference like that, and would I even go to a conference where I totally don't know what is the program, and how does it, and then once you actually go to one, you realize, hey, this is actually what it's really about. This is about the hallway conversations that I actually like so much better at a conference. And so it's creating that hallway conversations, the main conversations, and the main thing. And it's the same kind of thing that I'm hearing about. Okay, making sure that people can create their teams at the moment that it's needed.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in to learn more about that. So we'll definitely put some links there and into the show notes where people can learn more about that.
Yeah.
Let's yeah, we go ahead. Yeah.
I have an experience report online that I'll send you the link for. Um, but it's my experience with it has been really impressive. It's incredibly easy to learn. The group I worked with, now we did a lot of change management because we didn't know we were going to use fast going into this. So we did about 4 months of sort of figuring out what we were going to do and designing the work and doing change management. But when we started using fast, it took 2 weeks for people to sort of settle into working in this way. And in the overhead was 40 minutes a week.
Mm,
That's the entire
wow.
overhead of fast. And I checked in with them 6 months later after I worked with them for about 4 months while they were doing it, just helping them with some other related things, and then followed up with them 6 months later. And they said that um, it's created, it's really improved the engineering leadership in their organization, like people's ability to take leadership as engineers. And it's given them the ability to react basically to at a moment's notice to changes in priorities uh, in the organization, and everybody knows what's going on, who's working on what at all times. It's just an absolutely fantastic approach to software development.
So I'm looking forward, like I said, to learn much more. Okay, let's move to that last question. Who do you think I should ask next?
So when you originally emailed me about this interview, you asked that question. I sent you some names, and then you told me, "Well, I've already interviewed them." So
Well, I already interviewed Gitte, but the other person that you invited, Arlo, I didn't invite. He's on my list, but I didn't interview him yet. So
right,
that's
right.
indeed the
So
other
yeah, my
person.
my first thought was Gitte Klitgaard, who talks about psychological safety, and of course Diana Larson, who I created the Agile Fluency model with. But also Arlo Belshi is always an interesting person to talk to, and I don't believe you've interviewed him yet.
No, indeed. And I'm trying to bringing up on screen because yeah, okay, somehow I turned that extra screen off. It doesn't matter. Well, we'll bring him on or so I'll invite him because indeed, like we originally talked already a little bit about him. That's that one workshop, that parody workshop was really interesting for me to
Mhm.
learn, and he came up with some really interesting ideas as well that have influenced me over the years. So he's definitely a good character and a good person to talk to. So that's definitely
Yeah, and he has a lot
yeah.
of energy and a lot of fun as well.
Yes. Definitely, that's something. So, okay, to close up, what is a good way for people to reach out to you? What, if people want to talk and reach out to you, what's a good way to talk to you?
Best way to reach me is to my through my website, which is jamesshore.com. They've got a lot of that website's been up for nearly 20 years, so there's a lot of material on there. And there's a contact me link if you want to reach out to me directly. Uh, I used to be available on Twitter, but that appears to be going down the drain. So I wouldn't I wouldn't rely on that. So yeah, start with jamesshore.com and click the contact me link and check out the other material that's there while you're at it. There's a lot there, a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, I think so too. I'll add it to the show notes as well. That's definitely yeah, because I was running late, I didn't prepare that link for here, which I usually try to do. But I was running a little bit late when we were recording it, when we started this recording. Anyway, it's been a really fun moment to talk with you. You brought on a lot of experience and you bring back a lot of the history, and I really like that because indeed, like you say, you have that broad knowledge long time, but you've learned a lot. Like again, real agilist, we keep improving. You don't want to tell the same thing as 20 years ago. That would actually not be agile at all.
That's right.
And that's the interesting part. Where that's one of the reasons why I want to interview. For me, it's important to talk to both new people because they might bring in new things, but also bring back a little bit the history. And like you say, people kind of forget about that book from Mary and Tom, for example, because
Mhm.
that's an older book, and that is indeed why it makes sense to have a second version of your book because there are some new things that you've learned, and we want to bring into the attention indeed that the other things about that the things that were there in the past. So that was making what I was basically that is what makes this conversation everything that I was hoping for. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It was great talking with you, Eve.
Okay, so
Thank you for watching Who's Agile, where the stories of Agilists come to life. I hope you liked today's interview. Subscribe if you're not subscribed and want to get to know other Agilists.